It's time to explore the decisive moment for a little bit. Henri Cartier-Bresson, known frequently as HCB, was a painter who was inspired to become a photographer as a young man. And he was quoted as saying, "It's an illusion to say that photos are made with the camera. They are made with the eye, the head, and the heart. It's a way of life." His style of photography was heavily influenced by a major technological shift. You look at the camera in the top picture, it's a view camera. That particular camera took 8x10 sheet film. You had to work on a tripod. It was very bulky and cumbersome, and it took a great deal of advanced planning to do anything spontaneous. In the early 1920s, the Leica camera was introduced, taking 35 millimeter film and putting it into a camera that could fit in the palm of your hand and making spontaneous photography really practically possible. And Cartier-Bresson picks up a Leica at the age of 24 in 1932 and never really looked back. He's known for the Decisive Moment, which was the title of a book he published. To me, photography is the simultaneous recognition in a fraction of a second of the significance of an event, as well as of a precise organization of forms which gives that event its proper expression. Another quote, "Photography is not like a painting," Cartier-Bresson told the Washington Post in 1957. "There is a creative fraction of a second when you are taking the picture. Your eye must see the composition or an expression that life itself offers you, and you must know with intuition when to click the camera. That's the moment the photographer is created," he said. "Oop, the moment. Once you miss it, it's gone forever." And we can see that spontaneity in this picture of three boys at Lake Tanganyika. So what are some of the elements of the decisive moment? Gesture and expression play a huge part. Momentary alignment. If the elements in the photo are going to stay there for a while, it's probably not a decisive moment. Anticipation is a big part of it. You need to be able to anticipate the photo is going to come together beforehand so that you're ready for that exact moment. We need to see human interaction and connection in a decisive moment. Juxtaposition can play a big role, as two things that don't typically sit next to each other are in the same frame and relating to each other. We want to see tension about to resolve, a fleeting moment or expression. And it should be a candid photo. The subject should not necessarily be engaging with the camera, ideally unaware of the camera. Here we see a boy on his way home from the store in Paris in 1954. That expression on his face and the alignment in the children behind him is a decisive moment and a classic image. This photo is titled Derrière la Gare Saint-Lazare, Paris, 1932. And you can see that the person is hopping across puddles in the back of the train station, and he's just about to touch the water and get his feet wet. He's still dry right this second, but a fraction of a second from now, there's going to be a big splash and a very different picture. That's a decisive moment. Or this woman walking up the stairs and startling the pigeons. Again, these pigeons won't be there a fraction of a second after and weren't there a fraction of a second before. He was known to find a composition and wait for something to happen. He saw this staircase and knew that it would be a better composition if something were to happen in that gap to the top and the left. So he sat and waited for a bicycle or a pedestrian to walk by into that gap. Juxtaposition can be a big thing. This 1947 photo in New York City, we see a solitary person interacting with a kitten framed amongst the darker buildings in the lighter street and the light buildings behind them. And those leading lines and the light and dark tones bring the center of interest into that very small person and small kitten and make for a very compelling photograph. He believed it should be candid and not posed. Another photographer suggested that this 1944 photo of Henri Matisse, the famous French painter, was posed. Cartier-Bresson was furious and vigorously asserted it was candid. So let's look at some examples and ask ourselves, is this decisive or not decisive? Because this is one of the hardest parts of this assignment for students. I'm saying very decisive. We've got the children at various levels of up and down and alignments, and again, a fraction of a second before or after. This is a very different photo. Here's where juxtaposition could come into play. The tip of his pointer is just intersecting with one of the circles. Somewhat decisive. We get the lines of the geese almost lining up with the lines in the clouds. Generally, I would call this very decisive. You had to know where to look and be able to anticipate that that cow is about to lick her nose to be ready for this image. I want to talk to the students on campus or in Fort Collins for a bit. We tend to turn in a lot of squirrel pictures for some of these assignments. And they tend to be pictures of a squirrel looking around a tree. He's trying to decide if you're going to do something. You're trying to decide if he's going to do something. And we get a decisive 2 minutes. If you're going to give us a squirrel picture, make sure that it's a squirrel picture of behavior and spontaneity. Gesture, again, can play a big part in a decisive moment. The alignment of these girls and their expressions was very different right before and right after. Sports can be classically decisive. This is one where if you were to turn this in, you might have to make your case. The casual observer doesn't look at this and see a decisive moment. You know, that person could hold their finger there for a while. Those electrical arcs do move around a little bit, but I'm still not calling this one a decisive moment. Yes, we have alignment. No, this is not decisive. If you sat and ran your camera and took 10 identical frames here, you would have 10 identical pictures. This is not a decisive moment. This is more of a decisive minute and not what we're looking for this assignment. Definitely a decisive moment. Very spontaneous gesture. Not so decisive. Even with the swing in her tassel, there's just not a whole lot going on in this photo that's going to cause it to be different a fraction of a second from now or a fraction of a second before now. Definitely not decisive. It's a wonderful image of a theater production. The woman came out and stood there for a full minute. Definitely not a decisive moment. Sort of. If we look at the expression on her face, we can call that decisive. They're clearly interacting with each other, not aware of the camera, but they were there for a while practicing. Much more decisive in this case, where we get very momentary interaction and expression between the people on stage and the people in the audience. Again, sports can be classic decisive moments. This photo, a fraction of a second earlier, you would not have seen the ball, and both players would be on the ground. A fraction of a second later, that ball went past him because they both missed the catch. Not particularly decisive. Again, this is a pretty static photo. Not a lot of movement and anticipation in this image going on. But here we have momentary gesture and a photo that's going to move around moment to moment. Some suggestions. Use a moderate aperture, maybe f8, f11. This is probably not going to be a time when you want to be working with really shallow depth of field, at least not when you're starting out. Preset the camera's exposure controls so that you can work quickly without having to fumble around and get the camera exposure set. This might be a good time to work in one of the automatic modes. Look for fluid situations. Static situations aren't going to work very well. If you take a photo of somebody sitting under the oval reading a book, it's going to be really hard to get a decisive moment image because there's really nothing to anticipate other than that elusive page turn. Overshoot this assignment. Decisive moment pictures, when you're specifically looking for that, tend to have kind of a high failure rate because you're looking for that perfect timing, and that perfect timing takes a lot of practice. Remember, look for a decisive moment, not a decisive minute. If you can take multiple identical frames, it's not decisive. Technical considerations. Digital cameras have a little bit of a shutter delay, so you need to anticipate when that's going to happen. You can speed things up a little bit by pre-focusing when you see that the action's going to happen. Go ahead and push the shutter button halfway down and lock the focus, and that will speed up the process of taking the picture. Some cameras have a burst function where you can hold down the button and it will take 3 frames a second, 5 frames a second. I don't recommend that for this assignment because the chances are that the photo you want will be in between those frames. Better to pick your shot and do it when you want it, not when the camera wants it. Good luck, and call and be in contact if you have questions.